Hi, my name is Michael Morris, and I want to add my welcome as well as sincere appreciation to everyone here today for taking time out of their day to join us for this celebration or really commemoration. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, the president of Emory University, Dr. Gregory L. Fenves. With a career in higher education that spans over 3 decades, President Fenves is a distinguished researcher and as an educator, as well as an extraordinary leader. He has demonstrated a strong commitment to advancing faculty development, interdisciplinary scholarships, research, diversity, and inclusion, with access and affordability, all working to create greater educational opportunities for talented students of all backgrounds. In addition, in the spirit of today's Days of Remembrance program, we also welcome Dr. Fenves today as the son of a Holocaust survivor. This puts him in a special community of families, like others we will be honoring today, whose stories of witness and survival must continue to be shared. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Emory University's president, Greg Fenves.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that very kind introduction. As I look around, it is a real honor for me to be here in the House chamber, and I'd like to thank all of the statewide officials, the Georgia General Assembly members, agency representatives, members of the Consulate Corps, members of the Georgia Holocaust Commission on the Holocaust, and especially the Holocaust survivors and their families who could be with us here today. Thank you all. A couple of months ago, I was driving past Congregation Beth Jacob near the Emory campus. They were hosting a fair for children, and I saw kids playing, families gathered, immersed in conversation. But along La Vista Road, I saw multiple DeKalb County police vehicles and with flashing lights and armed officers guarding the festive gathering for protection. And at the time, I thought to myself, that seems totally normal. But then, as I was preparing for this day of remembrance, that image came back to me in driving past Beth Jacob and the police officers when I thought of Emory professor and now U.S. Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, and an essay she wrote for the New York Times earlier this year about the ubiquity of heightened security measures at synagogues, about the constant threat that individuals face just for being Jewish, about the rising tide of anti-Semitism in the U.S. and around the world. And in Georgia, my new state, it has its own dark history of anti-Semitism. The lynching of Leo Frank in 1915, the bombing in 1958 of the temple, which is now my synagogue. Sam Massell, the first Jewish mayor of Atlanta who recently passed away, once said, as a Jew, I had a cross burned on my lawn. I had to bicycle past the Venetian Club where they hung a sign that said, no Jews or dogs allowed. And at Emory, the extraordinary university I call home, that now has a vibrant Jewish community, had a dental school that in the decades following the Holocaust systematically marginalized its Jewish students, artificially failing them out of school. These stories, as disturbing as they may be, are part of the history in Georgia. And sadly, they continue to the present day. As you have heard earlier, the Anti-Defamation League recently released a report that found anti-Semitic incidents in Georgia have surged in 2021 compared to the previous year, reflecting a sharp upward trend across the nation, and yes, including college campuses. This is happening right now in our country. Hatred, is increasing every day. And it is only through learning and knowledge that we can strengthen our understanding and our ability to strike down anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of hate to create a more just society. To each of the survivors who are joining us today, know that your story, your courage, your legacy are the reasons we as a country and as a state understand the Holocaust and continue to teach about it, learn about it, and remember its horrors, so that never again will our world see such atrocities. Your advocacy and fearlessness have inspired and empowered us over 3/4 of a century on to reckon with the murder of 6 million Jews at the hands of the Nazis. You, by being with us today in this historic chamber, take what might otherwise be relegated to a history book and make it real, alive for all to see, and urgent to confront. The Holocaust was made urgent and real for me at a very young age because my father and his experience as a survivor. And that's why I want to share a story with you now, a story that has profoundly shaped my life. It's a story marked by hatred and suffering, yet elevated by resilience, bravery, and hope. It's a story of the kinds of people, refugees and courageous soldiers alike, who define the promise of America, the American spirit, and the American dream. It's my dad's story, but as the number of Holocaust survivors decreases each year, I realize that it is my story too, my story to pass along and share with future generations as the first Jewish president of Emory University, as a citizen of the United States, as a husband, a father, and a grandfather. This is the story of Stephen Fenves, my dad. He and his sister Esti grew up in a prosperous upper middle class Jewish family in Subotica, a town in the province of Yugoslavia with a large Hungarian population. My grandfather, Louis, served in the army of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire during World War I, and later with his brother published the most influential Hungarian language newspaper in the province. The family lived in an apartment above the offices and the printing plant. My grandmother, Clara, was a graphic artist who had traveled throughout Europe in the 1920s as an art student. My dad grew up trilingual in speaking Hungarian at home, Serbian in school, and because of his German governess, he learned German as well. In April of 1941, as an ally of Germany, Hungary invaded Yugoslavia and Subotica fell under occupation. At the time, my dad was 9 years old. The Hungarian anti-Jewish laws were immediately put into effect. The family's governess stomped out of the apartment, announcing that she would not spend another night in a Jew's home. My grandfather was led out of his newspaper office at gunpoint, and the business was confiscated. My dad's family had to sell all of their possessions for money to survive, including his prized stamp collection. They were forced to live in one corner of their apartment while Hungarian military officers took over the rest of the home. This dehumanizing confiscation and subjugation happened to Jews all over Europe and was now happening to Hungarian Jews. They lost their rights, and the lives that they had built over generations were instantly taken away. As the next 3 years passed, life for my dad's family became increasingly desperate, culminating in the deportation of the Hungarian Jews. Now, to put this in a historical perspective, for Germany, the war was all but lost. The American and British armies had landed in France on D-Day. American and other forces were moving up the Italian peninsula, and the Soviet army was advancing from the east. There was no hope of Germany surviving the onslaught of the Allied forces. But the Nazis were so dedicated and single-mindedly focused on annihilating the Jews that they continued to deport Jews and operate the death camps until the ultimate defeat. So, in 1944, my dad and his family were loaded onto a transport train, a train built to hold freight, but that was now packed with hundreds of people. My dad was 13 years old. They did not know where they were going. There was no food or water. The train just kept moving. Finally, days later, the train stopped, the doors opened, and the people were ordered off. They were at their final destination, Auschwitz. The guards took hold of the passengers, and within minutes they had selected my great-grandmother to die in the gas chamber, and the rest of the family was separated. The average time a person would survive in Auschwitz was 4 days. My dad would go on to spend 5 months there. He survived by using the German language that ironically his governess had taught him, acting as an interpreter for the officials who were shopping for slave labor and for the Polish political prisoners who were overseers of the compounds. He worked on a roof repair detail, and one day came across his sister Esti, who had told them that their mother had died, shriveling away from hopelessness. On another visit, he brought Esti food and warm clothing paid for by trading trinkets on the black market in the camp. But by the late fall of 1944, rumors circulated through Auschwitz that the Germans were planning on exterminating all the remaining prisoners, including the children, before the Soviet forces arrived. With this news, the Polish underground began to smuggle people out of Auschwitz, including my dad. Now keep in mind, he was barely a teenager, and because of his young age, he would have never been selected to work in a slave labor camp. The Polish underground knew this and coached him to tell the Germans a number of plausible reasons why he would be on a transport from Auschwitz. One day, as the prisoners were being selected for work lined up, the underground slipped my dad into the line. He was crammed into another train car. He didn't know that it was bound for a satellite camp of Buchenwald near Weimar, Germany. After 3 days on the train, my dad arrived in the small town of Nida Rochelle with about 300 other slave laborers. They were going to be forced to work at a small factory making aircraft wings for Messerschmitt fighter planes. An SS guard gave a talk to the group, and just before they were dismissed, the guard went up to my dad and said, "What are you doing here? I didn't select you." The guard recognized my dad from Auschwitz and knew that he wasn't supposed to be there. But my dad thought quickly and said to the guard, "Well, sir, with all these new inmates, they thought you would need another interpreter." The SS guard miraculously believed him. He would spend the remaining months of World War II as a slave laborer alongside the enslaved Jews and Russian prisoners of war. They were barely fed, and their lives consisted of nothing more than a daily walk from the barracks to the factory, hours of labor, and back to sleep. But even with the life being worked out of them, they resisted. The workers would sabotage the wiring in the wings of the fighters so the landing gear would retract on takeoff, but not upon landing. The wheels would not lower, and the planes would crash. They risked their own lives to ensure that someday the Nazis would be defeated. In April of 1945, General Patton's Third Army was rapidly powering through central Germany as Allied forces converged on Berlin. The Nazis were trying to hide the evidence of the camps, so they evacuated Nida Rochelle and through a forced march to the main camp 65 miles away, Buchenwald. Many died along the way, and during the trek, my dad was confronted by a guard, beaten, and his arm severely broken. He was very ill, but he made it to Buchenwald, and upon arriving, he collapsed and passed out in one of the barracks. When my dad came to, he was among American soldiers of the 6th Armored Division. American soldiers were liberating the camp. he had survived. In the weeks that followed, my dad, still 13 years old, had a choice to declare himself a refugee and face an even more unknown future, or return to his hometown in Yugoslavia with the hope of seeing his family again. He chose to go home. And when he got there, he found his sister Esti had survived Bergen-Belsen. My grandfather, Louis, had barely survived as a slave laborer in a Silesian coal mine, and 2 of his cousins had made it through as well. My grandfather was deathly ill and would die a few months later, but before he died, he wrote a letter to a friend living in New York City. My grandfather expressed his hope that his children would move to America. He believed that in the United States, his children would be given an opportunity to flourish, to lead happy, meaningful lives. My dad never forgot this message, and he still has his father's letter. My dad, my Aunt Esti, and their cousins went on to escape what was by then communist Yugoslavia. They ended up in Paris, which was in chaos after the war, flooded with refugees across Europe. They lived in a Hungarian slum near the Sorbonne that is now a prosperous left bank neighborhood. My dad learned French and excelled in high school. He and Esti were able to get American immigration visas, and they arrived in Chicago in 1950. And then another uniquely American story unfolded. After a couple years, my dad was drafted into the U.S. Army during the Korean War. His unit was preparing for deployment to Korea, but in the last moment, the orders were changed, and he became part of the U.S. occupation forces in Germany. Only 7 years after being liberated by the same army in the same country. My dad has always said that he learned what it is to be an American during his time in the Army. But I think he understood what this nation was about long before, when he was at Buchenwald, opening his eyes to see U.S. soldiers caring for the sick and dying, fighting for justice. He saw that then. When he brought his sister food and clothing in Auschwitz, he was already an American. When he helped sabotage German planes in a slave labor camp, he was already an American. And when he came to this country for the first time as a refugee, he was already an American. The American spirit is not bound by blood, race, religion, or place of origin. It is based on a set of ideals found within courageous people. My dad was honorably discharged from the Army, and his service earned him a path to U.S. citizenship and a college education through the GI Bill. While in college, he met and married my mom, Norma, his wife now of 60 years, and they raised 4 kids, including me. My dad would go on to become a renowned professor of engineering, being elected to the National Academy of Engineering at the remarkably young age of 45. I've spent my entire life trying to understand my dad's story, to live up to his expectations, to make him proud, knowing full well everything that he went through to give me and my siblings the opportunities that we've had in this great country of ours. If you look at my career and life, you can see the imprint of my father. I became an engineer, a professor, National Academy member. That isn't a coincidence. And even as a university president, with my dad now nearly 91 years old, he's still the one opinion, the one voice, the person I look up to and listen to more than ever. And being here with you today, telling his story so others can understand and learn, so that the atrocities of the Holocaust and the hatred that made it possible does not take hold again. That is the best way I can honor him. By understanding his story, we understand our own story as individuals, as a society, as a nation. We understand that the promise of America and the sacrifice it has always taken to make that promise real. That's what the truth does. That's what education does. That's what storytelling does. It touches our minds and our hearts. It holds us accountable to the truth. Thank you.